Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Planning for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to turn your phones off or put them on silent. On the agenda today is a question and answer session with the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. However, we've got some short items of business first, so do please bear with us. Can I now ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received.
Thank you. On item 2, declarations of interest, can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members present? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific items listed on the agenda?
Okay.
There being none, let's move on to the membership of the committee. Can I ask members to note the membership and chairing arrangements as outlined in the report? Is that noted?
Noted.
Thank you. Now, terms of reference. Can we note the committee's terms of reference?
Noted.
Thank you. And the minutes of the last meeting. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting on the 3rd of March 2021?
Confirmed.
Yeah. Can we also, on the summary list of actions, can we note the completed, outstanding and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent and received as listed in the report? Thank you. And now action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the actions taken by me as chair of the committee under delegated authority following consultation with the former deputy chair, and that is to agree the response from the committee to the National Policy Framework and National Model Design Code consultation. I have. What did I miss?
Standing delegations. I think we went
delegations. Past. Sorry, I took a piece of paper. I'll come back to that. To agree the letters to the Mayor on tall buildings and high streets. And can we also note the Mayor's responses subsequently received to the letters on tall buildings and high streets? Just to show you, I'm barely literate. Can we go back to standing delegations? Sorry about that. Can we note that on item 5, can we note the standing delegations of authority to me, the chair of the committee, as set out in the agenda and as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on 14th of May 2021.
Noted.
Noted, thank you. And unless I'm now out of order, we now come on to the main business on the agenda, and this brings us, which is a question and answer session with the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. I'd like to welcome our guests today. And that is namely Jules Pipes CBE, the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. We've got Lisa Fairmainer, Head of London Plan and Growth Strategies for the Greater London Authority, and Lucinda Turner, the Assistant Director of Planning of the Greater London Authority. Thank you so much for coming. I do realise that it's been a pressure on the diaries to come, so we really do appreciate you turning up today. And if I can launch with the first question, once I manage to shuffle the papers in front of me, to all the panellists today, or you can choose just one or all three of you, what are the priorities in the next 12 months for the delivery of the London Plan, and what are the key KPIs that you will focus on? So,
if I could kick off, Chair. I mean, the principal planning priority for the Mayor at the beginning of this mayoral term and throughout is clearly going to be the implementation of the London Plan. Clearly, it's only been published relatively recently. I think I've discussed with the committee before, perhaps informally, that it's still an entirely relevant document despite what we've experienced throughout the last 18 months. So it remains very much effective as the spatial development strategy for London. Obviously, implementing that relies on a number of things, not least the implementation through borough plans and supplementary documents. So there are obviously a cascade of there's a cascade of implementation that would need to happen going forward. But in terms of indicators, as the committee I'm sure know, the good growth objectives at the front of the London plan are the 6 principal objectives of the plan. Building strong and inclusive communities, making the best use of land, creating a healthy city, delivering the homes that we need, creating a healthy London, growing a good economy, and increasing resilience and efficiency. Some of those will have indicators such as growing a good economy, that there'll be numerous indicators, obviously outside the planning sphere, that will help us judge that. And then there are myriad indicators that are directly linked to the delivery of planning policy that will be captured in the data hub, the new data hub that's been created, and which will enable interrogation of those.
So in terms of the KPIs, is that something you're going to publish as distinctly?
Obviously, there is the annual monitoring report, which does have those high-level indicators, and will remain. We will continue to publish those on an annual basis.
And again, in terms of the KPIs, are you going to be publishing those heat lists that you get, the ones whereby you say whether or not you're doing well on a KPI, we're doing badly, or performing as expected?
I'm going to turn to Lucinda on formal monitoring, or Lisa, formal monitoring.
Shall I pick up? We are having another look at that, bearing in mind we've moved from a previous London plan to a new London plan. Chapter 12 of the London plan does have a list of KPIs, and we do expect to go out within the current financial year just to have a conversation with all those people who have signed up to receive and be consulted on information about those KPIs and whether there's additional ones. You'll be aware there's also really long-term data sets that are not covered by those KPIs, and it's our intention to continue to report against those. In terms of what style that might look like, the kind of plus or minus, and the analysis of the data as it's put out there, bearing in mind a lot of it is now digital, it's provided in real time. We're also having a think about that and how we present that to make it very clear and accessible to the public, and making sure that that narrative that accompanies the data set is most use to the public, and that will form part of the consultation as well.
Anything else on that particular issue? If not, I'll pass over to Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much. So continuing on the theme of information available to the public, I'm not sure which is the best of you to answer this, but I want to ask about how you'll ensure that the development, publication, consultation on new suites of planning guidance will be made very accessible but also inclusive, so that more Londoners can respond.
Well, as we've said before, as well as publishing both what we intend to be a very accessible PDF format, very readable and clear. As I've said to the committee before, that our intention is to have a new sort of online publication, very much web-based, with links, rather than a simple linear document. Whether in the PDF format or on the web, we'll be looking for it to be written in clear, direct, accessible language. The planners within the GLA have on guidance that has been drawn up and will continue on new guidance to undertake very bespoke engagement for each piece of work. A great deal of consideration goes into which groups and organisations we should be reaching out to, for example. I mean, a good example of that is the Public London Charter, and say the young people that were involved in that formulation, and how they would use public space, as well as those you would obviously expect, disabled people, older people. So we produce consultation statements as a result of that as well. So we make it clear the themes that have been raised throughout that consultation, and exactly what our response is to the issues raised, so they know how we have responded, or if we couldn't respond, why not.
What consideration do you give to sort of the more aspects of, I know, so you're writing a document that's essentially legal language, but do you consider getting like a summary version or anything else like that translated into different languages, translated into a signed version, audio version, even an easy read version, so that you're really reaching out to people? I realise there's a difficulty when you're talking about planning language and you don't want to change the policy or oversimplify, but how are you doing that to reach out to much more diverse Londoners that way?
Over to Lisa on that. As I say, I mean, I can't emphasise enough about the intention to make the actual guidance itself to be readable. But as for something more accessible,
I think, enabling screen readers, for example, and make sure that there's accessibility through, technology for people to access it. But I really do take your point about its usability and its readability for different reading levels, for example, and technical knowledge. And at the moment, internally, we put in place a 6-stage editor process, so that every single document has 6 separate stages where we check, for example, that every sentence is written in the most plain English style possible, bearing in mind its technical nature. There is a balance to be struck, and some things are more technical than others, and I think you'll notice that between the BC energy monitoring, for example, compared to Public London Charter, which are 2 quite different areas of guidance. But absolutely, as Jules has pointed out, it's our intention that everybody should be able to read it and engage with it, understand what it says, even if it is fairly technical matters. And that's really important to us, for people to be able to get to grips with exactly what it is we're trying to say, and for communities to be able to challenge where they believe that hasn't been met, for example.
Just to add to that, during the kind of consultations, we also run events and workshops and try and kind of make it as accessible and simple to understand for people as possible. But it is something we will keep under review, and kind of obviously is important to us. And we do take it very seriously. Every kind of single piece of guidance, we do that bespoke exercise. But if there are particular kind of issues you think that are being missed, we'd be happy to kind of consider those further.
I mean, it's obviously a difficult one because some of the documents are intended essentially for architects to look at, but some of them, like the Public London Charter, you'd expect the more general public to be looking at that and seeing whether things are done right. It might be worth trying to experiment with expanded accessibility, and for guidance potentially using translations might not be such an issue because they're not so legal, particularly if it's something like the Public London Charter. Anyway, I'd love to see that. Sorry, I'll move on to the next question.
Can I just ask on this? Assembly
we've got
Member
a hand.
Sheikh
Okay,
wanted to come in just on that one.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mention it before, but your line of questioning has inspired me, Sian. So, Assembly Member Berry, if you don't mind, I just wanted to build a little bit on the accessibility. And I think it's really great to hear about how we're hoping to improve it and ensure that the language is accessible as possible. And I just wanted to maybe add a kind of dimension slightly before that, that, which is, I think the point at which you're probably accessing planning papers, you've already crossed quite many layers of thresholds of accessibility, and great that we're making the language more accessible, but even just that layer below, how do we get people to the point where they do want to read planning papers? And so I was just wondering, as it seemed relevant to this conversation, if you could add a little bit about what we're doing to make the planning system more accessible so that we get people to the point where they are reading those papers. And I'll just add additionally to that, because I did bring it up with the Mayor at the last Mayor's question times around the statement of community involvement as one thing that's coming out from a lot of grassroots groups like Just Space, neighbourhood planners, even Centre for London earlier this year, as a mechanism that can enable planning to be more accessible.
I think most often the route into planning policy is, the route that people take is through a particular application, and also what would be even better is when they engage in plan formulation, and we certainly do a lot of proactive engagement and really facilitating good accessibility and input of views from the public in the development of OAPFs, for example. The trouble is we can only do about one of those a year. But I'd refer people to the Royal Docs OAPF as a good example of where the GLA really does put a lot of work into that with the local borough in making it as accessible for all members of the community to have an input in planning in formulating local planning policy. On a kind of a public position on engagement, we've talked to a number of groups, a number of people about this who have expressed it in terms of statement of community involvement. We're very keen on the principles. We're a little reluctant on the name because it's a specific thing under a piece of legislation that simply doesn't apply to the GLA.
Yeah.
So we would like to kind of establish I'm resorting to using the word statement, but a statement in the general sense that makes and policy that makes clear the engagement that one can expect from the GLA. It just might not be called an SCI.
Yeah, great to hear that you're keen on the principles of it, though. Oh, that's great.
Can I just add an extra dimension as well? Just to one example of something new that we're doing is outreach with schools to try to engage young people in planning and understanding. I mean, they care. Young people care about the places they live. They don't necessarily, though, equate that to planning and built careers in the built environment sector or engagement formally in planning. So we're working on a kind of planning challenge, hopefully that we will get kind of launched this year, and that will really try to make kind of planning and the thinking about places more accessible to people. So we're coming up with specific challenges in the Royal Docks area, for example, that schools can get involved in. We'll be providing materials, kind of some of the technology support for things like 3D models, etc. So we can keep you updated with that. But that's just an example of something new that we're trying.
Chair, if it's okay, it'd be great to keep the committee updated on that, and maybe we could even join one of the sessions that you do in the schools, because I think that's fantastic to get that very early on people's radar. Thank you.
Before I return to Assembly Member Berry, it might be worth including the London Youth Assembly as well in that, because there's some pretty bright people on that assembly, and it's well worth engaging them. Assembly Member Berry.
Yeah, so moving on to sort of transparency and accessibility on a different level, the Planning Data Hub. Can you give us an update on where that's at, what sort of feedback you're getting from, I think users now have some access to it, and what your aspirations are for what will happen next in terms of that contribution to greater accessibility and inclusivity of the planning system?
Peter Kemp's absence.
Shall I start?
Yeah, go on.
Can you outline what it is initially as well? Because I haven't done that, but you can.
Yeah, so it's basically trying to make available all the types of planning data about applications across London, the kind of types of the levels of affordable housing, kind of all kinds of different indicators from planning applications, etc., across every kind of borough. So there's been a lot of kind of work over the past couple of years working with boroughs to try to get their buy-in to it, because I mean we are dependent on the feed of their data. I'm pretty sure we are pretty close to every single borough kind of being live now. I can't remember whether I can say that every single one is, but it's imminent if not. There have been a few kind of technical teething problems kind of in terms of just some of that feed, because boroughs use different systems, so we're working with them to try to kind of streamline that as far as possible. But in terms of the intentions, we are intending to set up a steering group involving boroughs and other stakeholders to try to shape the future kind of development of what the planning hub does.
Is that not already set up yet? Sorry.
We've discussed it with boroughs. We haven't identified exactly who wants to be on it, but the discussions are underway with the different groups, and all are keen. We just need to kind of identify the particular representative, so that will be very soon, but people are aware.
Members of the Assembly will be invited, or I think I've been angling for an invitation. Because we are key scrutineers of that data, I think, and our access to it will be...
I think that's absolutely fine. I mean, we want the steering group to help us shape the kind of next phase of development and make it as usable as possible for people. And that will identify, are there any kind of gaps, what more could we do with the data, do we need to kind of change anything to make it more accessible or even more usable for Londoners and others. There are also, I think we mentioned in the informal session, the intention to do a digital kind of SLA, so that we can show live kind of data in terms of the sites, the capacity that's available across boroughs. So the development of that we would hope to start shortly. I don't know how quick a project that will be. I suspect it will be quite challenging, but that's certainly the intention as part of the next stage as well.
I think good luck on that, if you don't mind me intervening. Good luck on that. A dozen years ago, I had that intention of writing an app where you could look at planning applications across London. I gave up after about 7 boroughs because they all store the information quite differently.
Still manually entered.
Sorry?
All manually entered.
All manually, yes, indeed. Yes, I mean, works for Hackney, curiously enough, rather well. Anyway.
I think we're past that stage now,
yes.
at long last.
I
mean, certainly, there's been issues before with us trying to do scrutiny where the Excel spreadsheet that gets produced of the data that you currently hold, called London Development Database, doesn't have data that breaks down tenure properly, doesn't really say what's there in terms of accessible homes. So those gaps will be closed by this new data, this new hub of data, won't it? They'll be able to be...
They should be, and if there are any ones that are missing in this first phase, that's part of what the steering group is there for, to try to identify further ones that we can kind of try and tackle. You're right, it is quite, I mean, the data is only as good as the kind of inputs to it, so as I say, we're working constantly to just make sure and kind of to tweak things where necessary. So interestingly, I think some of the challenges that we thought might be the case with some of the data seems to be going pretty smoothly. In other areas, such as car parking, it seems to be more difficult to get the right kind of input. So we're kind of looking to make sure that the data that we are getting is kind of correct and high quality.
Excellent. And then, so the steering group will on an ongoing basis be able to suggest enhancements as well. For example, I think we recently asked what floor family homes were on, and you were not able to, no one was able to tell us that. There's not held data.
So the steering group can certainly help us kind of identify potential gaps, how we might solve those, I think, would be the
exactly,
challenge.
yeah. Okay, that's really, really useful. And do you intend to produce things like dashboards and things for people to be able to see key KPIs in real time, I think you mentioned.
The hub's configurable, isn't it? The front face of it is configurable so that one can create one's own dashboards of the things that interest the individual. So it's user configurable. I think is the phrase.
But MOPAC produce a lot of dashboards that are tailored to particular crime goals, for example, so that you've got something borough by borough that's very sort of nicely presented, and you can just quickly look things up. Is that something that you've got on the agenda?
Yes, that's what I'm saying, that the actual user, the member of the public, can sort of click menus and then configure.
Yeah. That's not the same thing as having a pre-configured nice display, though.
Oh, well, there will also be pre-configured things with things that we think are the headline issues, that will be easily accessible.
Right, okay, well, we'll keep a close interest in the progress of that. Okay, so just moving on to a much more general and bigger question here. In terms of the delivery of the London Plan, we've had for some time the planning white paper for the government, and then a few days ago we hear that that's been paused. Could you tell us what the implications of A, the original proposals, and B, the pause it might be on what happens next with the London Plan?
Well, obviously this breaks down into a number of areas, some proposals continuing and being implemented, such as permitted development rights, and then there is the larger reforms that they were proposing, which are the ones that appear to be on hold for the time being because of the degree of pushback from, virtually all quarters, I think it's fair to say. The impact, the principal proposals obviously were that of dividing areas up into three categories. And whether they were simply conserved or whether they were ripe for wholesale redevelopment or a sort of a middle ground, gentle expansion. And that does go against the grain of how planning policy has been conducted in this country for the last half century or more, and such a zoning system in this country is quite a foreign concept and is at odds with how we go about planning in this country. I think that the primary outcome would have been to prevent local people's input into specific planning applications at the time they were made. The primary, my reading of it is that the primary approach would be to, really to require people to think of all the things they don't want up front before anyone even puts an application in, so that one is preparing full briefs for site by site, and whilst that in an ideal world, that would be good. It's always good to have detailed site briefs. I think probably what would happen ultimately, though, is proposals would be brought forward that people were still unhappy with, still proposing something that, didn't think of that at the time to rule that out in the planning brief. And because it's not ruled out, then it could go ahead. I think also, though, it would be a bit counterproductive, because I think the government's obviously intention was to reduce the amount of planning bureaucracy in terms of planning committees and planning applications. I think inevitably, I've just described a situation where the planning brief is not tight enough, and that leads to problems. But on the other hand, it could be too tight, and therefore it always results in a planning application, because the developer would be seeking to exceed the constraints that have been put on the site in the zoning process. So I'm not sure that it would have actually delivered the outcome that the government wanted either. Yeah. So I think everybody would have probably ended up rather unhappy. But that's my layperson's take
We
on
do
it.
know that developers do tend to push it as far as they will go, and you might be right. They might decide that it's worth the hassle of going through a planning application.
And of course, when one makes an application, yes, and sadly, inevitably, everyone does get sucked into the viability issues surrounding a site. And those viability issues will change over time. So the viability issues at the time that that a developer intends to make a move on the site under whatever system, one requiring planning permission or in the zoning system, well, the viability could have completely changed from when the zoning decisions were made, therefore making it impossible to build it out. And again, that would require a planning application to vary from whatever the thing had been zoned for.
Can I just add kind of a particular dimension that is of very significant concern in terms of deliverability and implications for affordable housing and infrastructure, was around the infrastructure levy. And we are hoping that is paused and not unpaused. I mean, there are a number of difficulties with it. Firstly, including affordable housing in it just means that it would have to be set at a high level to achieve kind of similar levels of affordable that we are securing in London through Section 106, etc. I think the government underestimated significantly what's achieved within the London context compared to kind of others. Including kind of it in there means that the rate would be set, it would have to be set too high that it makes some areas unviable, but too low to achieve what you should be achieving in other areas. And even though they've now said that it would be set at the borough level, it's just you'd need, I mean, viability just varies kind of so much that it wouldn't be a simpler system that they're envisaging. If you were to get to something that actually works in viability terms, it would be hugely complex and many different rates. There are many other issues as well, including, I mean, the delivery of infrastructure up front alongside development is really important, not just to make the development and places that are being created work, but also for the existing communities there and the acceptability of the development. And the infrastructure levy doesn't do that. It's not paid until later in the process. You're not sure about how much, and the in-kind kind of dimensions are taken away. So it's actually left to the local authorities to pick up and borrow and deliver the infrastructure themselves, and without the certainty of what's coming. And I mean, in the London context, we now have, I think it's about half of the referable applications do the fast track route. They don't go down the viability route. So that kind of, I mean, some of the kind of perceptions about delays and everything else, I don't think are as expansive as kind of is sometimes kind of portrayed. But you can be sure that the valuations that are required, I think it would be 3 valuations for each development at different stages. And at times you don't, if it's built to rent, how do you value that? If it's commercial space that doesn't go on for sale and it's kind of, how do you value that? And if we think the debates and kind of complexities and technicalities of the current system are difficult, we just think they would kind of be manifold under the kind of infrastructure levy. But those are just some of the kind of points. I mean, suffice to say we have significant concerns.
I just have one other thing to bring to the committee's attention, and that's just to do with development management policies, those detailed policies. And within London, the London Plan fortunately sets those, so there's some uniformity of standards, and that's really enabled the rise in standards of design, of energy efficiency and sustainability, for example. Now, there was part of the planning reforms was to nationalise standards. Now, that's been done before in terms of space standards for residential, for example, or indeed the written ministerial statement about energy standards. But we do achieve above the odds here in London, and that is down to the detail. In many respects, that's held within the London Plan. And to put those at a national level with a one-size-fits-all approach, I don't think would be beneficial to London and the types of development we see come forward. So it remains to be seen whether that element is left within planning reforms or whether that's something that they choose to put a pause on.
I think that was one of our concerns, is that it was making redundant a lot of the good things we'd managed to do within the London plan. Just to go back to Jules very briefly then, have you yet had any indication from the new Department of levelling up housing and communities about what the next steps are in terms of this?
No, I mean, Lisa's in particular, and her, some of her team members do keep in close contact with the department. I haven't yet received anything. My last contact was with the housing minister a few months ago, talking about the levy and talking that minister through the benefits of our approach in securing planning gain through the threshold approach. And he was true to his word that he said he was promising a pause, and they have paused. So I don't know whether there's been anything in the last week or so since. I think that would have been quite soon for even any government, after any government reshuffle, to have heard from.
We met yesterday with representatives from DLUC, shall we call it, and DFT and BIS and Homes England, and we don't have any indication at this stage.
Okay, we'll keep a close eye on that.
Thank you. Assembly Member Sheikh. Actually, do you mind if I just nip in first and just ask, you talked, Ms Turner, you talked about the consistency of the approach to the levy, but the boroughs, they have a consistent approach to the sills, don't they? I mean, they seem to manage that.
But the key issue with SIL is it doesn't include affordable housing, it's infrastructure, so it can be set low enough to enable that. Once you include affordable, the levels would have to go up so significantly that it makes that harder. So we are all for some either continuation or some adaptation of the SIL, but that is to deal with kind of infrastructure, not affordable housing currently.
Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair. So I broadly agree with everything that you've all said, and I would say you're being very diplomatic, because I think the planning reforms are god-awful and really quite frightful, to be honest. And I think when I brought it up with our mayor at Mayor's Question Times, he even went as far as to say some people are commenting on the reforms as potential developers' charters, because they seem to be incredibly dysfunctional in, their aspirations, and I think your words, they would fail to deliver what they have set as objectives. And I think it's really important as well when we discuss these planning reforms to put it in the wider context of austerity over the last 10 years and the impact that's had on councils and the staff, that therefore, a lot of expertise has been lost because they've had to make systematic cuts year on year. And so I think I find it particularly grating when we talk about, the slowness of the planning process, when actually you've carved out a lot of the expertise in the councils that would have enabled that process to be more streamlined, which I think it's helpful. Therefore, the mayor has kind of created this fast-track process if you meet the threshold. So I kind of have two questions. My first one is, given that we kind of have seen a bit of a pause on the potential planning reforms, and we have a department called Levelling Up, and we have a new minister in charge, I think we're at a moment where we can begin to be clearer and louder on what we think those planning reforms need to be. So my first question is, how do we get people involved? So that was a weird, strange sound. How do we get people involved in defining the planning reforms, and how do we make clear the wider context in which they're taking place? And I'll let you answer that before I come in on my second question.
I'm stuck with an answer, specifically about engaging, galvanising people. Again, I'm not sure it's my role to galvanise the public against the government. I think there's probably rules about that.
I think you might be simplifying what I said as well, Jules. I don't hope you galvanise people against the government, but I think what I would hope is, the government of London can quite clearly make it, a point and use the platform to Londoners that these reforms will affect them, and so they should be part of defining what they look like.
Well, I mean, the mayor has been clear publicly, as you said, about his views on that, and those are supported in in policy terms within the GLA, in terms that all three of us have outlined, and whether it's the Mayor meeting with the Secretary of State and ourselves meeting with officials or ministers. In my case, you know, we advocate for the positions that we've outlined. Obviously, the Mayor has the ability to make that position more public than ourselves, and he takes the stance that he does, and has made public his position.
Okay, well, let's hope he continues making public his position, and perhaps nudges from yourself and generally the GLA family in order to, I think, if I might answer my own question, I think we need to keep this at the top of the agenda and make it very clear at every opportunity to make this intervention in the media, and more broadly when we have a platform, that this will have really far-reaching and deep repercussions. And I think, you know, it's something that we need to make sure that conversation is taking place in as many forums as possible.
Yeah. Could I just say? Dave, I want to try and avoid repeating myself, but that, you know, the two clear things are one, the potential disenfranchisement of you know, people's voice locally, and that is a very important issue. But the other important issue, again, that I've said, is that if it doesn't deliver, and I think all three of us said, if it doesn't deliver a better outcome, then surely that overwhelmingly is a reason why one shouldn't make the change. If it doesn't provide more affordable housing or greater planning gain from developers, why would anyone make the change?
It's a good question. And I'll just finish up on this final question, which is, I think something else that I think is important, again, to ensure we have context in this discussion is, I think it's fair to say that, you know, in different boroughs in London, the NPPF, or the wider context of viability assessment, means that it's harder to deliver affordable housing, or as much as maybe the communities want, or social housing, and actually where the council builds becomes limited in their choices. And I think sometimes this means, this inevitability is that you get communities pitted against councils when it comes to certain applications. And although there is a kind of consultative process that's statutory, many communities still don't feel like it's accessible enough. So I do think there is an appetite for reform. But I think, ironically, this seems to kind of put these two stakeholders that are sometimes pitted against each other, communities and councils, and I would say puts them on the same team against what we've described as planning reforms that are, you know, removing even what current consultation processes there are. So I know you've outlined this before, and maybe just a sort of slightly briefer summary, but what would be your ideal outcome from reforms?
I think, so I don't want to be unhelpful, but actually I'd say that probably the reform I'd like to see isn't so much within the planning process. It's actually it's broader than that. The key thing would be subsidy for affordable housing, because what is driving, to my mind, what is driving the conflict that you outlined is the fact that developments are expected to do, is the phrase, so much or too much. Sometimes they're not, but an awful lot of times they are, and it comes down to a conflict between affordable housing and other things that are deemed to be essential to make the development acceptable in planning terms. I mean, that latter thing actually ought to happen first anyway. I mean, legally, the planning system is meant to make, require from a development planning gain to make the development itself acceptable. And then we go further than that and say, well, look, society rightly expects affordable housing to be part of this, to address the local housing need. But with so many larger developments expected to do basic infrastructure, social infrastructure, supply a secondary school, or at least the land for a secondary school, and then affordable housing. And then so when all these issues aren't addressed fully to everyone's satisfaction, it's clearly going to lead to a distrust in the process. And also the fact that decisions have to be made on planning balance. It's very difficult to refuse an application simply because it falls down on one of those areas. One is required by law to accept the viability position of a particular development, and they are interrogated. We are very lucky at the GLA in having some excellent staff, meaning that we are no longer reliant on that constant flipping between poacher, gamekeeper when we used to go to the commercial organisations for a view on whether another commercial organisation's viability statement was accurate and fair. So we are now very good at interrogating those statements. But some of the times those statements are absolutely fair, that we can not find further monies within a development to address all the issues that local people, the local planning authority, and we, the GLA, would like to see. Over the last 3 or 4 years, it's been great to see that tailing off of sub 30% offers on referable schemes. I think we're on around 41% affordable, I think, on referable schemes at the moment, and a diminishing number come in at under 35. It's very, very rare we'd see something under 20. But that it's still not as much as we would like to see, and on those schemes they probably don't tick all the boxes that, as I say, we, the local planning authority, and local people would like to see. So sorry for I've probably wandered a bit, but I suppose I'm trying to describe what I think drives dissatisfaction with the planning system, rather than lack of consultation, for example. I think people say, well, I was asked my opinion, I gave my opinion, but you haven't done X, Y, Z that we, the local community, asked for. And that is going to drive dissatisfaction.
Yeah, renegotiate expectations. Thank you, Jules.
Thank you very much. I just remind committee members it's now 2:45, and we've got about 5 minutes left on this section, I think, but I'm sure you'll manage that. Assembly Member Best.
Yep.
Sorry,
Skipping
Chair,
a
I think
question.
actually I had the next question on PDRs.
Oh, I do apologise.
I was going to say.
I do apologise.
That's
You're
no
quite
problem.
Right. Sorry.
I appreciate I've been hogging the mic a little bit on planning reforms, but it is
I thought you'd
a little bit
covered that.
obsessive at
Sorry,
the moment for me.
Assembly Member Shaker. Sorry, Assembly Member.
So just I wanted to also talk a little bit about, obviously, given the pandemic and generally the need for economic recovery of London, but specifically the high streets. Have you undertaken any analysis recently on the impact of high streets from the combined threats of the pandemic and permitted development rights and online shopping, and what have your findings been on this?
I can't give you findings yet, but I can reassure you that we take it through a number of routes. We are monitoring it. Things through footfall data from credit card companies, for example, and there is a whole. We have a name for it, but it's almost kind of an observatory kind of thing, isn't it? It's kind of high streets. I'll supply the committee with the name unless either Lucinda or Lisa can remember it. But as I said before, I think it's crucially important as part of recovery to be able to curate the high street and have. Whether it's the landowners or whether it's local authorities, to be able to curate a new offer, and that was required even regardless of COVID. We all know that high streets were facing huge change. I think let the market decide, and if it's just more profitable to flip to unsuitable housing and have dead frontages interdispersed amongst still surviving shops, I don't think that's a recipe for reinvigorating the high street. If fewer high street frontages are required, it should be a managed retreat through a master plan process, rather than a kind of an ad hoc losing teeth here and there on the high street.
Thank you. And I think the question around Article 4 directions being potentially weakened already and under threat again, I think is really relevant to this conversation, because I think on one side you can't hear a government talking about levelling up and wanting to protect high streets whilst weakening Article 4 directions. I just also wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, we're very supportive. We work with boroughs to achieve that. We were disappointed when the government said that the bar would be placed higher for achieving them. But the pushback on this is probably even more unanimous than generally the wider planning reforms that we just talked about. The British Property Federation itself came out very heavily against PDR rights. But basically for the reasons that I outlined, I just outlined. Where there is a large landowner and they have all the frontages, that's fine. There is a curator of that space. I think what people are really worried about is areas of fragmented ownership, and therefore not having that guiding hand on and leaving it simply to the market, and that isn't necessarily going to result in the most thriving and vibrant offer. And it's key, I think, because of the whole community aspect that high streets create. It's not simply about, they're just places to go and buy stuff and come out with bags full of shopping. There are loads of community aspects and mental health and well-being aspects about what goes on high streets, and so they are places to be curated and people to encourage as focal points for the community. It's not just simply if they're not needed as shopping units, they could just be flipped to whatever.
Go as far as to say they're the heart of local communities. Thank you. I think there was a couple more follow-ups that maybe Assembly Member Baker might come in on.
Of course, Assembly Member Baker.
I'll try and keep you short. That's okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to briefly follow up on the questions about high streets particularly, and also the balance with online shopping, which is obviously in our minds after the pandemic. Firstly, you're saying this is something you're monitoring, the impact on high streets. Are you particularly monitoring the impact in high streets in outer London, where they, I think the point you've made, that these are that people value them as part of the community, not just as really important. Is that something that you're looking at particularly? Yeah, I think it'd be really, really important to keep an eye on that. And people want the high streets for the community aspects as well as the convenience, but they also want the convenience of home deliveries, online shopping. How does the London Plan support a sustainable balance of that, as this has been sort of put on steroids over the last year and a half?
I mean, online shopping gives London a real problem with regards to logistics space, last mile delivery. In an ideal world, there would be a lot of aggregation space, disaggregation space for combined deliveries. They would be all supplied with 100% electric vehicles, and so there are various policy hooks within the London Plan that support this. Obviously. It's getting to a point now where logistics space is worth more to a developer than flipping it to housing or using it for housing. So it highlights the need for this kind of space to service London well, and for it not to be a disruption and resulting in an increase in pollution. I think. If the heart of your question, though, was about the balance of it, I think it's not about trying to maintain a balance. It's more of being prepared and having policy that allows London to adapt and adapt well, which is the heart of good growth. So I just described the policy approach on ensuring logistics space. I think the other hand is not trying to preserve the high street in Aspic, because I think we all agree, it was changing anyway. You're absolutely right, it's just been accelerated by the pandemic, the changes that were afoot anyway. So the policies and also the work that the Regeneration team have been doing as well, and the regeneration team's work on high streets began before COVID. It's been slightly adapted now for the recovery, but nevertheless, because it was recognised what was happening with high streets, this approach of adapting and encouraging thought within boroughs, and therefore encouraging thought within their communities about how they might see their high streets adapt over time to a different usage pattern by local people. As I say, fewer bags of stuff coming out of buildings and more experiential, more food, more entertainment, more community activity as a replacement for straight retail.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Again, I'll remind Assembly members about timing. If you watch the timing, then I don't have to. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon all. And I should warn you, I've got a few follow-ups as well, so not to cut you short, but mindful of Andrew's watch.
I shall try and be quick, Chair, and short.
Firstly, I wanted to move to the subject of undeveloped developments, as they were. So often the quote is buy land, they're not making it anymore. So I just wanted to follow that up with a question around what extent is that an issue in London regarding developers acquiring land, acquiring planning permission, but those developments going unbuilt.
I don't think it's so much an issue of simply not building and therefore land banking, but there is an element by some, are they developers or are they just simply investors investing in sites and then selling them on? And the problems that gives us is that when they're sold on, then the new owner comes back to us to renew the planning permission and needs to get more return from the site to help pay the inflated costs that they paid to the previous owner. And then that gives us the headaches. That is what gives us the headache, I think, in London, rather than simply straight land banking. It's that transferring of sites. And as I say, it's not so much between the sort of the well-known developers, usually. It's more, there's the more investment bit of the real estate sector.
100% I'd agree with you on the issue of land banking, but I would say several cases that I've seen of things going to planning commission and that planning being banked. I think that, it certainly happens, perhaps not to the extent as the land banking, but it does happen. But on both those issues, what more could the Mayor and you yourself, the Deputy Mayor, do to address that?
Well, incentivising bringing things forward, that's...
Could differentiate, I think, really for opportunity areas. So, those opportunity areas that first got put in place in 2004, and those areas of brownfield land, like the Royal Docks, for example, or Paddington, which now is really nearing the end of its life as a redevelopment area. And I think that for those, we are starting to monitor better in terms of opportunity areas, and in terms of our digital, we're going to be putting some monitoring data up so that people can interrogate individual opportunity areas and have a better idea of which ones have basically been built out. But I think that programme has been very effective, and that's exactly why London doesn't have a lot of brownfield areas that have these great sites that are unused. And I think that the applications that Jules was referring to, where perhaps they may try to increase the value of a site through a planning permission, there is still a use going on. The site is still being used. It may not be used to its full capacity, but they tend not to be bits of dirt, shall I say. They do have another use going on. There are some exceptions, and we know where they are in every borough, and they tend to be through absent owners who are very difficult to track down. Local authorities do their best. There's been an example up near West End Green for a very long period of time, for example 20 years, a site just sat there. But I think we really are running out of those types of sites where an absent owner isn't bringing a site forward, and that's through the hard work, I think, really at borough level as well as at mayoral level, to make sure that those bits of land that are not being used at all don't just sit there.
I mean, obviously, over time, there's been various ideas, use it or lose it policies, which would require national legislation. Certainly, reform of CPO. I forget which bit of the Act, but the particular bits of the Act that require compensation at hope value rather than existing value. That would be would perhaps concentrate minds amongst donors.
Is there any legislative or devolved power, legislative changes, I should say, that you'd ask to get some devolved power from government this term to work on that?
We would continue what we've been doing over the previous term as well, such as CPO powers. That's clearly one that we've consistently asked for and will continue to do, because I think that would be a clearer route through some of this.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing really quickly? Just kind of one of the other factors in getting sites brought forward and actually developed, with my other hat on, is infrastructure provision and transport kind of connections to those, because that often is the key to unlocking a lot of the sites we're talking about and making them more viable and making it kind of more likely that that development will come forward. And in some areas there are grampians put on kind of which stop development until that is in place. So I would kind of say that continued funding and investment in infrastructure across London will be absolutely key to ensuring we continue to deliver the kind of development and sustainable development.
I'm very pleased Lucinda's reminded me of that. Yes, I mean that is a very apposite point. And an example of that very thing being the Bakerloo line extension. The Old Kent Road has any amount of development sites that are being brought forward, but there is a cap on the amount that can be brought forward without there being an increase in public transport. The Old Kent Road is saturated bus-wise. I don't think Lucinda would claim that she could get more buses along there. There's a limit in distances on cycling and walking for many. The Bakerloo line extension would open up all those, and so this isn't sort of a theoretical, sort of a notional amount of development. These are developments that are actively seeking planning permission, that will have grampian conditions put on them, that yes, you've got permission, but you can't build it out until there are solid foundations on the Bakerloo line extension. So that kind of transport infrastructure and that kind of investment is key to unlocking some sites. On a smaller scale to do with infrastructure, though, we have our infrastructure coordination service that we've developed at no cost to the GLA. It's being funded through the lane rental scheme monies that the utilities have to agree along with TfL to use it for whatever purpose, and we got them to fund the coordination service that we're currently running. And one of the things it does, it identifies areas of London that for the want of a utility investment or could bring forward a particular site or increase the likelihood of a particular site being brought forward. So at both ends of that kind of infrastructure spectrum, the smaller end, the more realistic end, we are doing what we can about that. But the real heavy end, such as transport, that is going to require significant investment from outside of our own funds.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to hear, but it just makes me think of a recent massive development approved near me, which was in one of the lowest PTEL ratings in London, and was still approved by the GLA, regardless of the fact it was outside any transport network. So I think those two statements are fairly conflicting, but I'm glad to hear hopefully that won't happen again. I was going to move on, but mindful of time, onto talking about the 2017 Strategic Housing Market Assessment, whether it should still be considered up to date, fit for purpose. Clearly, in its iteration, there's a lot of emphasis on one-bedroom properties, especially in social housing. So, just to ask, really, will you be doing anything to reconfirm or recalibrate housing need metrics in the strategic housing market assessment in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly given the likely impact on need for social and family units?
Lisa, this is probably best position to
Of course.
do smart.
We're working really closely with the City Intelligence Unit, and they're looking to release a new set of population projections on the 30th of September. And those are both trend-based projections and housing-led projections. And I think it's clear that at this point in time we don't have a very good understanding of shifts in those patterns. We've clearly seen a drop-off in terms of migration into London, and also migration out of London of older people has accelerated, for example. But what we see is that a lot of people want to move out of London, and we don't know how many of those people that will continue to be their dream, or how many people will decide after all they'd rather stay in London. So we need to keep an eye on those demographics. And we do expect over the next mayoral term to engage with Londoners about the future of London, that includes things like housing capacity, housing need, housing supply, and the different types of housing that are suitable for different households, for example. I think it's important to note that even with the new London plan we have, a very large percentage, and off the top of my head I think it's 65% of the housing need should be in affordable tenures, and that's clearly not entirely deliverable within the current planning process. But we obviously seek to optimise the amount of affordable housing that comes forward on any particular site, and we've talked about that earlier. So we have that focus on affordable housing that's been successful. In terms of other housing types, we'll continue to work with boroughs, and again it's for them to look at, for example, things like family housing, student accommodation, special needs housing. What of those needs are in their area, and how do they plan to provide it, and also for gypsy and traveller communities, and what provision is required on that. And we're looking to do further work on the needs survey for that. So at the moment, the policy framework that we have at the moment, as we said, we're in the implementation phase. We're going to monitor what housing comes forward. We hope it will be aligned with what housing needs London has, and we'll also continue to do work on what those needs are going forward, whether there's a shift in them, and what the relationship is. But I think at this point, it's so recent that that policy was put in place. It hasn't been embedded properly in local plans yet, for example. We need to do work on that. And we also don't really understand the longer term trends of the impact of the pandemic and perhaps changes to working patterns, for example.
So, given what you said just now, would you consider the strategic housing market assessment from 2017 to be fit for purpose today?
I do think it does remain fit for purpose at a strategic level, but I do think it needs to be read alongside the local work that boroughs are doing, particularly for things like family housing. There are quite big differences, for example, in different boroughs and their makeup. So yes, it does apply at that strategic level. It certainly remains the most relevant document where boroughs haven't done that work themselves, but I think where they have done that work, we'd want to be drawing on both references to make sure the right mix is provided.
So not to be read as gospel?
Sorry?
So not to be read as gospel, almost, is the assessment?
Yeah, I think it needs to be read in context. And as I said, you know, those demographics, we have a report next year perhaps from the census. And again, it's been a long time since we had the last census. So all of those things need to be taken into account.
Would you urgently look to set out any new planning guidance that might supplement the strategic housing market assessment and help boroughs with putting some more context between the two?
Not at this stage. I think we're very clear through the examination in public that was something we were leaving to local areas to define and to set out those parts of their boroughs where they think it's best to bring forward that family housing. So whilst we continue to work with them, I'm not sure the boroughs at this stage, and we certainly haven't heard from the boroughs, that they're looking for us to provide further guidance on it.
Thanks. I'll try and move on in the interest of time. One final question from me, please, is how will the London Plan and the Mayor's planning powers facilitate fibre broadband for all new developments? And how are you working with operators and developers on this?
I mean, it's in the plan. The requirement is in the plan. We're less than prescriptive, though, on specific technologies because they get to be out of date pretty swiftly. But Lisa, what's the specific wording?
It's either full fibre or the equivalent, and that's because some networks have copper, for example. The Virgin network has copper within it, and therefore, short of them replacing their entire network all at once, there will be parts of their network that still have copper. So that's why that equivalent. We are in discussion with our colleagues in the infrastructure team about how we deliver this, and we are thinking about how best to make sure it's rolled out appropriately across London.
And then there's the work that the Chief Digital Officer is doing as well to maximise access and broadband across the city.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's useful to say after that exchange about the SHMA that the Planning Committee has had is not entirely convinced, hasn't been entirely convinced in the past. We have a new Planning Committee, so I'm not going to speak to you, but in the past hasn't been entirely convinced that the SHMA truly represents the housing needs of London, and it's probably a debate we're going to continue to have in the future. But if I can now, Assembly Member Berry.
Just wanted to double check. When you mentioned, Lisa, about the City Intelligence Unit producing a new set of population projections, did you say that would be published and will we be able to see it? Is that something that will actually just be put out to the public?
Absolutely, on the website on the 30th of September.
On the 30th of September. Okay, useful. Thanks. Okay.
I'm going to, a little later, I'm going to put some of these questions down as written questions because we do need to get through important stuff on the agenda. So thank you. The next section we're talking about is about good growth, and I'd like to pass over to Assembly Member Baker for that.
Thank you. Thanks. So where affordable housing is co-located with market housing, and this is obviously a subject it's very, very topical. Well, it's often very topical. Areas of the property or its facilities are in some cases unavailable to tenants in the affordable homes. Do you think such a situation is necessary in order to deliver affordable housing?
The separation that it's necessary. You're saying,
correct? Yeah, having facilities and areas that are inaccessible. Do you think that's necessary?
The straightforward answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
There is, to my mind, the Mayor's mind, that there is no excuse, no reason, justifiable reason why there would be a material difference in approach to the building, the doors of the building between tenures, the access from the different tenures to outside space. Mm-hmm. And play facilities for children, for example, and that is the policy hook for that position is in the plan, and guidance that's coming forward and that we've consulted on the housing guidance develops that policy. Or the theme of that policy. It can't create new policy, but it builds on that policy to make clear those expectations about equal access. Obviously, the reason why I was a little hesitant is because you do then get into facilities which are beyond the normal, or what historically has been the normal provision in housing. It's only been a relatively recent development that people build things with gyms, developments with gyms. The Victorians didn't. We didn't until probably 20 odd years ago. We started putting gyms in housing developments. And those are paid for additional extra. concierges, flower arrangements, expensive carpets. These are all things that a developer can choose and has the right to. We can't rule that out. Developers can choose to put those into a development, and a housing association, a social housing provider, can choose not to want to pay for them or have their residents pay for them. The law is clear that you can't cross-subsidise one tenancy to another, and so therefore you can get a difference between tenures in the facilities that they have. I'm pleased that there's a societal reaction in line with the Mayor's position against things like shared space for children and children from different tenures being able to play with each other. And so I think that there are a series of key social points such as that, where I think as a society it's absolutely vital that we do maintain that accessibility. I think we're into rather more abstract territory if we're going to say that housing associations have to provide equal access to gyms, swimming pools, whatever, aerial swimming pools strung between buildings in Nine Elms, for example. It's beyond the scope of a housing association to buy into those kind of facilities.
A note on that. I was going to say, I think there is provision coming forward that people can buy and a pay per use for those facilities. So obviously it's not part of their service charge, and that would be totally inappropriate. But if they wanted to use those facilities and they're within that block, they should be able to
because if on the private side they've already paid for it through their service charge or whatever, there is no excuse if someone else who hasn't paid for it being able to opt into paying for it. So there's no excuse for exclusion on that basis. But one would have to be very careful about what facilities that actually applied to.
Yeah.
I think that I hope you won't saying that sounds lovely in practice, but in reality, if you're in a home that you're deliberately in because you earn less, then that won't make a blind bit of difference. So I think we need to be careful about what
there is a moral principle there about exclusion and the basis on which that obviously the people are excluded from all sorts of things due to cost across the board. Yes. And so that's not introducing anything new, but it would be introducing a rather dubious practice to say on principle you're not allowed to use it even if you're willing to pay for it.
Oh, that's true, but exclusion can take many forms, and these are designed into some developments that there will be an element of exclusion, whether that's on principle or on cost. So, and I also think you've explained why in practice there are things that can't be blocked. But what's the impact on social cohesion of having developments where it's so clear that some people living in those developments will not be able to access, for whatever reason, some of those facilities? I mean, that is, surely a principle of good growth that we don't damage, or create additional barriers in society.
I was going to just really differentiate between those add-ons, like a gym, for example. This would not apply in any way to those communal areas where people from different tenures would mix, to playgrounds and play areas. So that level of accommodation which is standard, which comes as part of a package of an acceptable quality of life within your home, those things, there's no charge, so that's all part and parcel. So it's the things as though, for example, I can't even think of a brand of a gym, for example, I don't do it, but say a David Lloyd, for example, set up. For some people, their membership was included within their service charge, and then other people can pay to use it. It's that type of facility, which is may or may not be provided by a private provider, or may be provided as part of the housing scheme. It's only those, not the appropriate standard of residential accommodation, which everyone shares.
Be okay at this point for Assembly Member Berry just to come in? Was it on this point?
It's exactly on this point.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to get
okay?
some clarity on the process, because obviously my group fed back on the draft London plan to say that you should include specifically playgrounds in your tenure blind policies, and this wasn't done. Now you're talking about bringing forwards some requirements that there is a right to access facilities, and that there will be some facilities, I think, Jules, you said there are some key social facilities which should never be segregated. Where are you going to define that? In which document? Are you going to bring forward some guidance? Because it's not currently in the London plan.
The principle of equality
It's
of
a
access.
moral principle, but you need to write it down somewhere.
But the principle is in the plan, and then the planning guidance then expands on that, and it will be contained within the housing guidance.
So it's going to be inside the housing planning guidance?
Yeah.
It is, and some of the things that are quite specific, the same external appearance, the entrances, for example, they should all have access to the same amenity and play spaces that serves the building, equitable access to on-site cycle parking, car parking spaces based on the proportion of homes, and quite specific provisions around the dislike of gated communities, for example, and some parts of the ground floor public realm being just set aside for certain residents and not others.
Okay, and you're hooking that all to the principle of tenure blind housing, because these things are attached to housing. Okay, that sounds really helpful.
Yeah, that builds on policy D5, which relates to inclusive design.
Member Baker.
Thanks. So our follow-up is, you've probably answered quite a lot of this, but just to give you an opportunity if there's anything you've missed, how will you ensure your planning guidance will guard against segregation and exclusivity based on housing tenure? Is there anything else you haven't covered on that?
Not really. That was probably off the top of our heads. That's probably gives the best, the gist of the kind of things that will be contained, and the fact that it will be in the housing design guidance.
So it's going to look at the sort of things that should be available to everyone, and some things that may be. I've got a short follow-up.
Well, just to be helpful, when will we see this guidance on the land?
The first, there was a pre-consultation draft that went out, and that's already on the website. We're currently reworking that, partly because it wasn't written perhaps in the most accessible language. We're rewriting it to take account of that. Partly there's some points, particularly this committee has raised around tall buildings, and we're revisiting some of those thoughts. So it will be pushed back to later this year.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Baker, please carry on.
Given the importance of affordable housing, the current model of cross-subsidy obviously includes private sale as a way of securing affordable homes. Do you think this model is still as viable given the rising costs of construction materials and labour from all sorts of things that have happened over the last couple of years?
It's not a viable way of delivering the amount that we need as a capital city. Even combined with housing grant, neither is sufficient. As Lisa correctly said, my understanding is also 65% of all housing built in London ought to be an affordable tenure. Not all social level, but a big proportion of that 65% should be social, and an element of intermediate. And we are nowhere near there as a city as providing that. The system doesn't provide for that. And I don't want to take up your time rehearsing what I said to questions earlier about viability, but that's what's driving this. It's still obviously a very valuable tool, and we would be loath to lose it, but if anything it needs to be enhanced. But quite how, and because as I say, when you're still requiring all these other things from a development, it will only pay for so much. I think probably going back about 10 years, it's probably pretty standard for developers to expect about a 20% return. I think we're getting them down to about 12.5 on many of the developments that we see. Much below that, the real estate community will say, well, actually, we don't get enough return in London, we'll go and develop elsewhere, thank you very much. So probably 12.5% is probably about the realistic limit, about how much one can ratchet that down. If we then do those viability tests and can't find any more, then we're looking to housing grant alone. I mean, those are the two main policy levers for achieving affordable housing. Neither is sufficient for the ambition that we have for London.
Am I putting words in your mouth to say it's becoming even less viable as a way of delivering anywhere near the amounts of affordable housing that we
yes, because and I think the best example of that that illustrates that is the appetite for housing associations now to do their own cross-subsidy, because we have gone through a phase of over the last decade of housing associations effectively being their own developer, which is laudable. You know, they don't have that leakage of profit to the market sector in doing it themselves, but they're finding it more and more challenging now, and one seeing less and less of it, and it's relying more and more on the strategic interventions of the mayor with affordable housing grant, on the strategic partner model, to make those work.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much. I intend to...
Actually, I have
you've got
number
a
10 as well,
co-design.
don't I? No, I've got number 10 as well. Sorry,
Yes, I was about to say co-design.
Apologies.
I beg your pardon. You carry on.
I do have number 10. I can't read my my notes properly. How will co-design with communities be enabled and encouraged?
Risk of rehearsing my OAPF answer.
I mean, to me, there's a whole host of levers that communities can use. There's neighbourhood planning, for example. That's a form of co-design at the most statutory level, when they can write their own planning policy, and that has direct legal status as part of the development plan. So I think that's a very powerful tool that some areas have taken up. There are examples, I think, around co-design of engagement, and that's really critical to understand how people want to be engaged with, reaching out to the people that are being targeted, and rather saying, this is how we do our consultation, saying, well, how would you prefer we spoke to you? And I think that's been really beneficial, making sure there's far more voices around the table, informing how we plan for the city. And I think there's really good examples, both ourselves and across the boroughs, of doing that. On individual planning applications, there is the requirement for engagement with communities and demonstrating that engagement when a planning application is submitted. And many organisations do that very well. Grosvenor has done some really interesting work in this space. And I also know of a scheme where Tony Pidgley at Berkeley Homes, for example, got the community to redesign a tower element in a scheme that he had as a co-design process. I think, so there's really good examples out there. It's difficult to see the length that you could insist, and I think most large house builders or most large developers would engage with communities up front to understand what they value about an area or what they want to see, and probably do it quite well. They might not always do exactly what the community asks for, but they certainly do undertake that at pre-engagement level. I think there are challenges around where people may not want to engage with the community, or certainly not want to listen to the community, and we've got limited leverage in which to address that, and we have to consider planning applications as they are sent in to us, and take into account consultation responses as part of our consideration. But ultimately, as Jules rightly points out, the planning balances and you know the statutory requirements of how we determine planning applications and how boroughs determine them, it is really how we inform that. But if I could plug one thing, it would have to be involvement at the plan making stage, because once that development plan is set, it's very difficult for us to refuse planning applications that meet the development plan, irrespective of however strong a community feels about an individual scheme.
Remember best.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to come in on the community aspects. I feel quite strongly about this one, coming onto the GLA especially from a council role and as a community activist working on many applications. I felt like the GLA was this like mythical rubber stamping machine where things just go off and get passed and you can't get in contact with anyone. And on the number of occasions I've tried to email in objections or speak to someone. I've never been successful. So I feel like there's a really, the engagement is so far torn between the GLA and the communities it ultimately serves. And I think that's shown no more than when you look at the fact that you've called in 19 tall building applications and granted those against the wishes of not only the local community but the local planning authorities as well. So I just really want to know what will happen this term to address that, to work more closely with communities, to be more in touch, feel more available, and to hopefully create communities around planning applications that work for them.
Well, I mean, on the point that you said that you weren't responded to, I mean, there's no excuse for that, and happy to look into that, although by the sound of it might have been some time ago. I mean, anyone writing into us, I think we acknowledge every letter. Obviously not every name on a petition, but individual letters. I think the key issue is that the GLA is effectively, apart from the call-ins at stage 3, the GLA is not rerunning the process of the local planning committee, and often we are approached as if that is the possibility that we are effectively rerunning it, which we aren't. I mean, probably Lisa's probably best positioned to describe in fewer words than I would take, because she'll do it succinctly and accurately about quite what our role is. You know, it's principally looking at whether, you know, from a strategic perspective, whether the applications are meeting the London plan, and often that isn't going into the same detail, such as daylight, sunlight issues that are rightly undertaken by the local borough. So sometimes we will receive complaints from people saying, you know, we don't feel the borough has addressed the daylight, sunlight issues about this development and it's too tall, for example. But if it satisfied the borough, you know, we're not regulators of boroughs in that sense, and so we don't revisit that. And I think that probably does lead to some disappointment and dissatisfaction in people in the way the GLA handles applications. I would dispute that all 19 were tall buildings. They would have been obviously a certain size, but then of course they would be by virtue of the fact they were referable applications. And I think certainly some of them were, well, in fact, the overwhelming majority of them would have been up for approval, recommended for approval in local planning committees. So it would be, I think, a misrepresentation to infer that overwhelmingly the 19 were things that had failed the tests of local plans and local policy, and the GLA had effectively overruled that. There would have been plenty of examples there where technically, and I'm not taking away the right of local members to determine that and overrule their officers. That's absolutely fine, part and parcel of the planning process. But equally, there's another stage where the mayor can choose to reverse that position and agree with something that's more in line with perhaps the original recommendation to the local planning committee.
I definitely kind of contest that you're suggesting that the GLA doesn't rerun these planning applications, because that's precisely what it does. No,
I said the referrals we don't. We're not rerunning. It's the 19 we do.
Right.
Stage 3s are absolutely rerunning. The GLA becomes the local planning authority. But in all the referrals, which I thought was part and parcel of your question, all which are the overwhelming number of the planning applications that the GLA considers, you know, stage 1, stage 2, we are not rerunning the planning process that has occurred locally.
And it certainly is 19, and I think to my memory it's only 2 that have been rejected after call-in. 19 tall buildings accepting and 2 rejected.
Yeah, but I was saying that they weren't all for tall buildings.
Sorry?
My point was, though, that I disputed that they were all for tall buildings.
Yeah, and I'll confer again. I'll suggest again they definitely were. I think something that comes out of that for me, though, is earlier we were talking about how with the SHMA, Is that how we... how with the SHMA, we like to put it back into the local authorities. If they've done the extra work, if they know what's needed from the 10 years and the makeup of that application, then put it back to them. But then that runs conversely with the next argument of let's then take it from the planning applications if they've rejected it and we'll overrule them. And it doesn't seem to match those two statements for me, from saying, you know, there needs to be acceptance the local authority knows best to the local authority doesn't know best when it is perceived the GLA wants to do something.
Well, I mean, in terms of the local work for the local housing market assessment, that, as Lisa has said, adds sort of a finer grain detail to the strategic London-wide SHMA and the detail that's contained within that. And when the GLA takes over an application, the local work that the borough has done would absolutely form part and parcel of the evidence base on which the GLA is looking at that scheme. So it's absolutely not a case of you, the borough, have determined the application and rejected it on your local data. We are taking it over and ignoring your local data and doing it on the London-wide SHMA. That isn't how it works. The borough data would be absolutely part and parcel of the judgment. The reversal of a decision, if that's what happens, isn't based on our SHMA trumps a local SHMA.
Jules, mindful of time, I'll leave it there, but hopefully probably a debate will have more because I certainly have a different view to you on that. But if I could just ask one point which I think would be helpful. Currently elected representatives of the GLA, when they speak, they take up time of a local resident. Is there any way in which an elected GLA member could speak at these planning applications and not take up time for local residents?
I mean, we can always look again at how the time is allotted, but it's the mayor has been quite flexible on the amount of time that is given. I think the standard time is 15 minutes at call-in for objectors, 15, 20 minutes, but he has allowed up to about 30 minutes on some where there have been significant numbers of objectors. So, you know, although there is a benchmark figure, it's one that's departed from regularly in allowing more time. So, you know, and the mayor would always hear from an assembly member. So I don't think it's costing, you know, I can't think of an instance, and I can't imagine the suggestion from the planning team that we would strike out an objector's voice or reduce the amount of time simply because an assembly member wanted to speak.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Jules.
But it is the case, is it not, that during those called-in applications that you give you negotiate with the developer, but the community perhaps to put a couple of more stories on a building, but you don't then negotiate with the community groups about that change.
I mean, we do go out on a stage 3. We do reconsult, and where we are asked to, the planners meet with community groups, and that has certainly happened previously when they're asked. I wouldn't meet them because I don't meet the applicants either.
Yeah. Okay.
To keep it even, but we do. I know there was on the recent Richmond case, there was suggestions were made that people weren't met, but they were. Admittedly, not as many times as between officers, the case officers and the applicant, because obviously there's a detailed technical negotiation going on about a relatively limited number of issues.
It just seems like the developer gets more of the mayor's attention than the community groups who may
not so much the mayor's attention. I would agree that more of the technicians' attention in the development of the report. Yes.
Thanks very much. Thank you. If no more is said, I intend to, for the benefit of Assembly members, I intend to turn 11, 12 and 13 questions into letters to for written reply so that we can get through the business, because otherwise we're not going to. It's as simple as that. So if that's agreed, is that okay? Nobody had supplementaries on any of those? No? Let's go straight now to design, density and building safety if we can. And I'd like to hand over to Assembly Member Berry for this.
Yes, if I can maybe combine my two questions into one, actually. It's about small sites and what happens next. And I think there's two sides to this going on at the moment. We've got the scepticism of the inspector saying, well, we don't think you can achieve all of that on small sites. What are the incentives for, how are developers going to do this? And I think there's a big question about whether or not enough small sites are being brought forwards by developers, builders on private land. I know there's a lot of dead space in communities. But then we've also got issues with some small sites that are being brought forwards in the public sector, largely, that are very, very controversial. Residents on estates where there might be a ballot if something was being demolished. Instead, they want to build on the ball court or what have you, and there doesn't need to be a ballot, but that is still a bit of an issue for the local residents in their consultations. So I just wanted to ask, really, in both of these directions, what are you thinking of doing next on small sites when it comes to talking to people who might do things, incentivising people to do things, and are you going to bring anything different forwards in any of your planning guidance?
You're right that the planning inspector disagreed with the figure that we put in the plan. I probably would say, though, it wasn't so much a disagreement about the absolute figure or the potential. The policy still remains within the plan as it was.
Yeah, the numbers were just
cut
back.
The speed of delivery.
Yeah.
And the inspector felt that it was over-optimistic that we would deliver that, London would deliver that number, and that localities would respond, boroughs and localities wouldn't respond with the speed that the plan figure would hope for. So it fell back to practically the windfall number that actually you're practically guaranteed of getting, because that's what currently happens. So the policy is still there. We're providing guidance to be able to facilitate that and encourage borough planning departments to consider it, be aware of it, and to be encouraging of that development. I think I think there are plenty of examples where it works well. I visited one. In fact, it was probably one of the first things I did once I started venturing out of the house.
I don't know exactly which example you're going to give because they're so rare. Go on.
It's the one down in Lambeth. Behind an estate, and it was
it's a different one.
Yeah, no, and it was on the site of garages,
that's the pocket development.
And it's a fantastic row of it's about half a dozen on a former garage site on a Lambeth estate, and it can work really well. It obviously is. It works less well if it's proposed on a site that's less redundant. And that's when that conflict arises, something similar to the conflict we've been talking about earlier, where people understandably don't see an increase in affordable housing in itself as sufficiently balancing the loss of an amenity that they've enjoyed. So obviously, stating the obvious, it would be better if those sites were left. And what are the more trickier sites, perhaps, tackled, such as redundant garages, and actually taking on where you have a row of garages and for the want of one, there's one refusenik who still wants to carry on storing things in the garage, holds up a whole development of redevelopment of garages, and those kind of stories are legion, and they are difficult for housing authorities to take on and cut through.
Is one of the answers to make these more community-led in the first place, so that people who might want to keep the garages get to sort of negotiate with their peers about what happens to a site?
Absolutely. I mean, clearly this would be a thing for the boroughs. It's something we would encourage, but it's not something that we can necessarily facilitate. But but I think that throughout the plan it does encourage community engagement, and that would be a good case in point for it.
So I think the thing that Assembly Member Best was talking about earlier on, about things not being brought forwards for development despite the fact that they have planning permission, I think there are smaller sites where that is slightly more prevalent than on the bigger sites. I think the bigger sites are more likely to be brought forwards when they can be, although we've got things like Earl's Court. But I've seen examples of people buying up a small site, getting planning permission and flipping it, and then literally nothing happens. And the whole, you've got to activate the planning permission, often they'll just demolish what's there, and it just is literally left as gravel. And that's incredibly depressing. That's what I'm saying. Is there anything that can be done to either help communities to get those sites brought forwards by new owners, maybe, or to purchase them themselves? We don't have community right to buy like they do in Scotland, but is there anything that can be done with your funding to get more sites into community-led?
Well, where we have applied funding is and active intervention is actually unlocking sites, not ones with permission, but ones where actually they are deemed to be too difficult, and we've had to we've intervened to de-risk them, so that we've advised and funded boroughs particularly, and some others, to be able to bring forward and de-risk a site so that it is more attractive for a developer to take forward. And obviously in those situations, enforceable guarantees are applied to make sure that it is brought forward and not just flipped by the person you've done all that public work for. I think on those sites that someone is just seeing as an investment opportunity, I think probably one's falling back on some of the tools that would be equally as useful on the big sites. They might not be, they're probably more likely to be employed by the borough, such as compulsory purchase. I suppose for small sites that have been allowed to become derelict, as you describe, there are probably some levers the boroughs have to be able to intervene to require the owner to bring the land back into some sort of productive.
Yeah, because this is the issue. By activating the planning permission, they're demolishing what was there, making it unsuitable even for meanwhile use.
Yeah, and yeah, there aren't any easy answers, particularly when these kind of issues require, a degree of application that the boroughs no longer have the resources for.
Okay, we'll keep talking about that issue, I think. Do you want me to, am I right to pass on, Chair, or is there an aspect of the question I've not covered?
No, that seems absolutely fine. How do you envisage tall buildings might change in their design and distribution during this mayoral term? You knew you were going to get that question from me.
Don't
say you did.
Looks like he's never thought about it before.
I really was giving it proper thought in the actual question I was being asked, which was about how do I think they will change and their distribution. I think it's hard to generalise. Obviously, the whole committee is aware of Policy D9 and the requirements that it makes, both calling for boroughs to designate specific areas that are suitable for tall buildings and those that aren't. There is also D9C though, which means that, like most planning policy, one doesn't always have absolutes. So even if an application is made that falls outside an area designated for tall buildings, one is required to consider whether it could still be considered suitable in that location. So I think the change is the fact that there's a greater degree of scrutiny and an additional sort of policy hurdle to be met. Whether this will how this will materially change where things are located and how tall they might be, I would struggle to, with any certainty, to make a statement on that.
Is it fair to say that if they are above 6 stories and the application is above 6 stories and it's not in an area designated by the local authority, that you would be minded to refuse it?
No, one would have to go through the policy tests to see whether it could still be found acceptable in planning terms.
But surely any overriding of that would have to be as a result of special circumstances, rather than every single application that comes through you can ignore the first 2 criteria and just stick on subparagraph C.
Well, I'm going to defer to Lisa, who's probably better at describing how policy D9 is negotiated by an application.
I think it's true to say that the principle of the location and the height of the building doesn't get changed. So there's still a principle of policy that says, on the face of it, no, you shouldn't have a building of that height on that site because it falls outside of the designated area designated in the local plan. But beyond that, you do still need to demonstrate harm. And if you're not able to do that, again, you couldn't refuse a planning application if you were unable to identify what harm and include those in a reason for refusal. Now, in some areas, it will be very obvious why that area is unsuitable for a building of that height, and both boroughs and boroughs do refuse applications like that regularly because of the scale, massing and height. But there are probably sites, for example, during plan making stage, I can think of one in particular where the site was in use for something quite specific. It wasn't seen likely as a site that might come forward. Circumstances suddenly changed, it did come forward, and actually when you look at it, what they proposed on that site was acceptable in planning terms, albeit that there's a policy objection to, in principle, to having a tall building on that site. And perhaps the reason the local plan didn't designate it is because there was no expectation for that site to be redeveloped for a host of reasons. In this case, it was because it was a waste site, so it wasn't recognised as likely to have a tall building on it. It was used for a waste purpose. That provision, that capacity was provided elsewhere, therefore it met all of the tests of the development plan, and actually the principle of the height on that site was not something, even though it was outside an area identified for tall buildings, it wasn't something that could justify refusal. And I think we will continue to see those types of applications come forward where they do fall outside those areas, but the UK planning system is not as binary as that being a one strike you're out. That principle has to be put into the planning balance alongside everything else, and then consideration as to how you determine the planning application.
In determining harm, would you be considering this committee's work on building typologies?
We've only just become aware of it, so we're certainly going to have a good look at that.
I'd be very grateful if you could let us know whether or not you can use that work that we've done when assessing the harm of tall buildings. Thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, I've got so many questions on this that I've got to hold back. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair, and in the interest of time as well, I'll try and combine mine. It's just sort of topic change, wanting to talk a little bit about building safety. Obviously, we have D12 policy set out, but I think, given Grenfell as a sort of something that's scarred into everyone's memories, is something that is, still very alive, given the inquiry, but also kind of the how can I say this, the frustration from the community more recently on not being consulted about whether the building block should be demolished or not. I think it's always important to bring that in for the context. But yes, D12 sets out building safety expectations. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that, and then specifically how we can go further. And one thing that I've identified that I would like your thoughts on as well as sprinkler systems, and how we can push developers in the right direction quite firmly on ensuring that those are in new builds as well as fitted in old builds.
So, as you know, D12 has requirements about developers demonstrating that they've sought the highest standard in fire safety in a development. And of course, there's also policy D5 as well that requires the inclusion of an evacuation lift in lifted properties. The guidance is there to seek, it seeks to ensure that the fire safety is considered absolutely from the earliest point in design and not an afterthought or a building control matter after an architect has designed a building. And as I said, it places the onus of demonstrating compliance firmly on the developer or their representative, such as a fire engineer. I think what's interesting is that the government have adopted something of this approach with their Gateway 1 process, and that requires any relevant building that falls under that bit of legislation. It requires it to produce a fire statement, which is referred to the Health and Safety Executive. And that's it. It applies to any building that has more than 2 homes in it and an educational establishment, or rather an educational establishment. And if they're more than 18 metres in height or 7 stories. So we're at the moment looking at how we avoid duplication in what we are requiring. And we have a particular problem at the moment as well, nationally, that there is a complete lack of qualified people to consider these statements that are being required. So there's a piece of work nationally to be done there on training a sort of suitable cohort of people. Unfortunately, I don't think this is something that we can address through the AEB, because these are things, obviously, a level of qualification beyond sort of an engineer, not something that's simply a trained layperson could do.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realise there was a shortage of people who could interpret the fire safety sort of documents, and that's a bit of a concern. And I hope there's some kind of sort of speeded up, fast-tracked way of enabling people to trained up quickly, which kind of leads to my other question. I mean, I will come back to the point on sprinklers specifically and whether we can do more to incorporate that in pushing London developers in the right direction. But I also wanted to ask slightly more broadly, have you seen improvements on the kind of the general adherence to building safety coming in and fire safety coming in prior rather than after the design of buildings?
People are complying with the with our requirement to demonstrate the degree of building safety that they've achieved and evidence that has been considered at the beginning of the process before we approve. So I suppose it's tricky to prove the absence of something, the counter narrative that would, but I think it's fair to say that we could demonstrate.
We are seeing fire statements come through, and I think it's really critical just to note that point about the fire engineers. There's a whole host of different ways in which fire safety can be demonstrated and provided in terms of the specific internal provision. And certainly I would not want to be involved in those conversations. I'm in no way qualified to advise, which is why we've been very specific in the guidance that it's for a qualified engineer to self-certify against those professional qualifications, and it is a very high level of qualification beyond the initial engineering, and that's because of the complexities of how fire behaves, for example, and what different approaches can be taken. And so there's no short-circuiting that kind of technical knowledge and the ability to be one of those people who we would accept as somebody qualified to self-certify a fire statement, and that approach will be different in any scheme. It will be bespoke for that specific.
So just to finish off then, the specific inclusion of sprinklers as a requirement for safety, building safety, fire building safety documents is something that is currently, if I'm understanding correctly, missing from the London plan, and explicit expectations for that for new builds. And how can we rectify that is my question, because I think it feels like a 101, and I can appreciate developers have their own expectations or their own understanding of what building safety looks like, but I think sprinklers, again, in the context of Grenfell, were quite important, or the fact that they weren't working. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm happy to take that. I mean, I understand it was explored at length in the examination in public for the London plan, and it was decided against. And partly it is that bespoke approach. It may well be that sprinklers are part of an overall package of delivery of fire safety in any scheme, but we certainly don't want to create the impression that, you know, if you put sprinklers in, the job's done. That's a whole package. Now, there will be many schemes that will come forward with sprinklers as part of the solution to ensure the safety of people, but picking out one particular mechanism and favouring that above any of the other.
No, I was hoping it'd be in addition rather than as a singular.
Certainly my understanding was the reason sprinklers, absolutely no specific mechanisms are specifically mentioned for exactly that reason, that it will come down to ensuring that the individual detail of the package that clearly includes the cladding, the ducting, any refurbishment to the building in the future, that's done holistically without pointing to any specific mechanism that may or may not be appropriate in that design. But I think sprinklers will certainly be part of the solution for many, many buildings.
I do hope so. Thank you, Chair. I think this will maybe be something I'll be picking up at some point in the future.
On that very important question, that brings us to the end of the questioning. I'd like to thank you for all your contributions, and you're free to leave or see the boring bits we're going to do now. So, but thank you so much.
Thank you,
it really is appreciated. Can we note the report on today's discussion? And can we also delegate to me as chair, in consultation with party group lead members, to agree any output from the discussion?
Agreed.
Thank you. We now go to item 10, which is the Planning and Regeneration Committee work programme. Can we note the committee's work programme and additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the informal meeting with the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills?
Noted. And Chair, just on the work programme, if I just might, I know that I mentioned this to you briefly, casually, and I think we've also actually spoken it more broadly and formally about having, hopefully at one point, an open session, whether that's like an open mic or we can invite communities to come and be part of one of our future committees. So is that something we'd work out outside of the space?
I think that's something that I don't think anybody wouldn't be sympathetic to that.
Great.
That being said, can we note the committee's work programme?
Noted, thank you.
The date of the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 9th of November 2021 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber at City Hall. I've got no urgent business, but only to thank the staff for setting up this meeting, and particularly the security guards, security staff today, who are there to protect us. And today, they've only been there to protect us from ourselves. So thank you very much for that. It's very much appreciated. And with that,
GLA, Chamber, Sound.